Are you deaf, specialist? I said give me a real pilot, not a grease monkey with a torque wrench. This is $1 million gunship, not a lawnmower you can tinker with. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the exhausted ground crew, the sound thin and brittle in the aftermath of the siege. The air at forward operating base Ares still tasted of cordite and scorched earth, a metallic tang that coated the back of the throat. The pre-dawn attack had been a brutal, close-run thing, a storm of mortar fire and probing attacks that had tested the perimeter's resolve to its breaking point. Now, in the bruised, purple light of the rising sun, the chaos had subsided into a different kind of tension, the frantic, adrenaline-fueled hum of damage control. Men and women moved with the jerky, over-caffeinated energy of survivors, their faces drawn and pale beneath layers of grime. The woman, her rank of specialist visible on a dusty collar, her name tag, Sharma, barely legible, didn't even flinch at the insult. She didn't look up. She didn't pause. She simply finished tightening a bolt on the Apache's main rotor hub, her movements economical and precise, a small island of calm in a sea of frantic activity. Her world was the machine in front of her, the intricate lattice of wires and hydraulic lines, the cold, hard logic of metal and mechanics. Her silence was a shield, a fortress built of focus. The man berating her, Chief Warrant Officer 3 Davies, was the opposite of silent. He was a creature of noise and bluster, a veteran pilot whose confidence had long ago curdled into arrogance. He paced before the damaged but miraculously intact H-64E Apache, his flight suit pristine compared to the ground crew's, his voice a grating intrusion on the grim quiet. "We have a recon team pinned down on the Asher Ridgeline," he broadcast to anyone who would listen, "and this is our only bird with a full rocket pod. We need to get it in the air 5 minutes ago, and you're sending me a mechanic?" He gestured dismissively at Specialist Sharma. "Look at her. She probably doesn't even know how to start the APU," but from the makeshift command tent 100 yards away, General Madsen watched the live drone feed on a flickering monitor, and his eyes weren't on the loud, gesticulating warrant officer. They were on the woman's hands. He saw the way she handled her tools, not as foreign objects, but as extensions of her own fingers. He saw the fluid, unthinking confidence in her posture as she moved around the complex aircraft, a familiarity that went beyond textbooks and training manuals. He'd seen hands like that before, a lifetime ago, in a place where legends were forged in silence and proven in fire. He saw not a mechanic, but a master of a craft, and a deep, forgotten memory stirred within him. If you believe that true competence doesn't need to announce itself, type silence in the comments below. The world of FOB Ares was a symphony of controlled chaos, but Specialist Sharma moved through it with the quiet grace of a conductor who knew every note by heart. While others shouted to be heard over the drone of generators and the clatter of equipment, her communication was in the subtle language of action. A nod to a fellow crew chief confirming a fuel line was secure. A hand signal indicating the precise torque needed for a rotor blade bolt. A steady, unwavering gaze that said more than 1,000 words of false bravado. Her uniform, a standard-issue maintenance jumpsuit, was stained with the honest dirt of her trade, the dark smudges of grease, the faint, rainbow sheen of hydraulic fluid, the pale dust of the unforgiving landscape. She was of average height, with a wiry strength that was not immediately apparent until you saw her effortlessly hoist a heavy tool case or maneuver a replacement avionics package into its tight housing. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe, functional bun, and her face, when not obscured by shadow and grime, was a study in impassive concentration. She was in every superficial way unremarkable. She was designed to be overlooked, a cog in the great, grinding machine of military logistics. This was the image that CW3 Davies saw, and it was an image that confirmed all his preconceived notions. To him, the world was divided into two distinct groups, those who flew the machines and those who merely serviced them. It was a simple, arrogant calculus, and Sharma fit neatly into the latter category. "Specialist," he barked again, his impatience boiling over. My co-pilot is down with a concussion, and the other flight crews are scattered dealing with the perimeter breaches. I need someone in that front seat who knows what they're doing, not someone who's going to press the wrong button and jettison our only Hellfire rack. Go find me an officer. Go find me a pilot. Now, Sharma finally finished her work on the rotor. She wiped her hands on an already filthy rag, the motion slow and deliberate. She looked at the Apache, her eyes tracing the lines of the fuselage, the deadly promise of the weapons pods, the delicate, complex machinery of the tail assembly. She saw not a weapon, but a responsibility. She saw a lifeline. Her gaze was not that of a mechanic admiring her handiwork, but of an artisan evaluating a masterpiece, or perhaps a warrior sizing up an old and trusted steed. The onlookers, the other mechanics and armorers, shifted uncomfortably. They respected Sharma. They had seen her work miracles on birds that other crews had written off as scrap. They had seen her diagnose a phantom electrical fault in minutes that had stumped technicians for days. They knew her competence, but they also knew the rigid hierarchy of the Army. A specialist did not question a chief warrant officer. A mechanic did not pretend to be a pilot. They remained silent, their complicity born of regulation and a desire to avoid the hot glare of Davies's wrath. Sharma's response, when it came, was barely a whisper, almost lost in the wind. "The bird is green, sir. All systems are nominal." It was a simple statement of fact. It was a declaration of her completed task. It was also a subtle act of defiance. She had not run off to find an officer. She had finished her job. For Davies, this was the final insolence. His face flushed a deep red. "I don't care if it's gift wrapped from the factory, specialist. I need a qualified body in that cockpit. Is that concept too complex for you to understand?" The injustice of the moment hung thick in the air, as heavy as the smoke that still drifted from a burned-out supply truck near the ammo depot. It was the timeless conflict between the seen and the unseen, between the loud proclamation of status and the quiet demonstration of worth. Sharma stood her ground, a silent testament to the latter, her very stillness a rebuke to the officer's empty noise. The radio in Davies's hand crackled to life, a desperate, static-laced voice cutting through the tension. "Ares Command, this is Recon 1. We are taking effective fire from the ridgeline, multiple positions. We can't hold this peak for more than 10 minutes. We need immediate air support. How copy?" The voice was strained, each word punctuated by the sharp crack of distant rifle fire. The request was not a request. It was a plea, a death sentence waiting to be commuted. Davies snatched the radio. "Recon 1, this is Ares Flight Lead, solid copy. Air support is being prepped, hold tight." He turned, his eyes sweeping the flight line with a new, frantic urgency. The other Apaches were in various states of disrepair from the mortar attack. One had its canopy shattered, another had a damaged tail rotor. Sharma's bird, Valkyrie 7, was the only one that was combat-ready. It was the only hope that Recon 1 had. "Where is that pilot?" Davies roared, his voice cracking with genuine desperation now. His arrogance was a luxury he could no longer afford. The general's voice suddenly came over the command net, calm and authoritative, cutting through every channel. "All flight-qualified personnel were either wounded in the attack or are engaged in perimeter defense, Chief. There is no one else." A wave of despair washed over the faces of the ground crew. They all knew what that meant. Recon 1 was on its own. They were going to die on that ridge. In the ensuing silence, a new sound emerged. The crisp, metallic click of a helmet buckle. Every head turned. Specialist Sharma was fastening the chin strap of a pilot's helmet that had been sitting on a nearby supply crate. She moved with a practiced fluidity, her hands no longer those of a mechanic, but of something else entirely. She pulled on a pair of worn flight gloves, flexing her fingers, the leather creaking softly. The movements were not hesitant or uncertain. They were rhythmic, ingrained, a muscle memory awakened from a long slumber. She walked to the cockpit of Valkyrie 7 and began to climb, her boots finding the footholds on the fuselage with an unerring familiarity. Davy stared, his mouth agape. "Sharma? What the hell do you think you're doing?" That is a direct order violation. Get out of that aircraft. But his voice lacked its earlier conviction. It was tinged with a bewildered confusion. Sharma settled into the front seat, the co-pilot/gunner's position, and her hands began to move across the instrument panel. It was a dance, a symphony of precise, deliberate actions. The flip of a switch, the press of a button, the turn of a dial. Her fingers brushed over the complex controls of the target acquisition and designation site, her touch light and confident. There was no fumbling, no searching for the right switch. It was a seamless, fluid process, as natural to her as breathing. She was not learning the machine. She was communing with it. She was waking it up. The other mechanics watched in stunned silence, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. They were seeing a side of their quiet colleague that they never knew existed. The woman they knew who spoke in quiet tones about hydraulic pressure and avionic software was now strapping herself into the deadliest attack helicopter on the planet with the calm assurance of a seasoned warrior. The auxiliary power unit of the Apache whined to life, its high-pitched cry cutting through the morning air. A moment later, the twin-turbine engines began to spool, the deep, guttural thrum building into a ground-shaking roar. The main rotor blades, which had been drooping listlessly, began to turn, slowly at first, then faster and faster until they were a transparent, shimmering disk, a halo of lethal potential. The transformation was absolute. The quiet, inert machine was now a living, breathing predator, its energy vibrating through the very bones of everyone standing nearby. Inside the cockpit, Sharma's focus was absolute. Her world had compressed to the glowing green displays in front of her, the feel of the cyclic and collective controls in her hands, and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. She ran through the pre-flight checks from memory, her eyes scanning the myriad of gauges and warning lights, her mind processing the data with the speed of a supercomputer. Engine temperature, nominal. Rotor RPM, green. Hydraulic pressure, stable. Weapons systems, armed and ready. She was no longer Specialist Sharma, the mechanic. She was the ghost in the machine. Davies, shocked out of his paralysis by the sheer, undeniable competence of the display before him, finally made a decision. The lives of the men on the ridge outweighed any regulation. He scrambled into the back seat, the pilot's position, fumbling with his own helmet and straps. "Fine, you're the gunner," he yelled over the intercom, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and grudging respect. "Just follow my lead." Sharma's voice came back over the comms, and it was a voice they had never heard before. It was calm, clear, and utterly authoritative. It was the voice of command. "Negative, sir. You're the co-pilot. I have the flight controls." Before Davies could protest, Sharma's hands moved with breathtaking speed. She brought the Apache into a low hover, the machine rising a few feet off the ground with impossible smoothness. There was no lurch, no drift. It was as steady as if it were anchored to the ground by a column of solid steel. Then, she did something that made every pilot and crew chief on the flight line gasp. Instead of standard climbing forward takeoff, she executed a perfect pedal turn, pirouetting the massive gunship on its axis. Then, she pitched the nose down and flew the aircraft backwards, accelerating rapidly before pulling the nose up into a steep, near-vertical climb that defied the laws of physics. It was a maneuver straight out of an air show, a display of breathtaking skill and utter mastery of the machine. It was also a maneuver that only a handful of the world's most elite test pilots could perform. The Apache climbed like a rocket, a streak of olive drab against the pale morning sky. The soldiers on the ground could only stare, their mouths open, their minds struggling to reconcile the quiet mechanic from 5 minutes ago with the aerial virtuoso who was now at the controls of Valkyrie 7. Davies was pinned to his seat by the G-forces, his mind reeling. He wasn't flying with a mechanic. He was flying with a god. The journey to the Asher ridgeline was a blur of controlled violence. Sharma flew the Apache not like a helicopter, but like a fighter jet. She kept the aircraft low, hugging the contours of the rugged terrain, her hands and feet in a constant, fluid dance on the controls. The gunship weaved through narrow canyons, and skimmed over rocky outcrops, a fleeting shadow that moved with predatory grace. In the back seat, Davies could do nothing but watch his own instruments mirror the impossible feats being performed. His hands, which had been gripping the controls in a white-knuckled clench, slowly relaxed. He was witnessing a level of airmanship he had only ever read about in classified after-action reports. This wasn't just flying. This was an art form. This was a complete symbiosis between pilot and machine. On the command tent monitor, General Madsen watched the drone feed with a grim, knowing smile. He had been right. The hands had told the story. He leaned into his microphone. Valkyrie 7, this is Ares Command. What is your status? Sharma's voice came back, as cool and steady as a surgeon's scalpel. Command, Valkyrie 7 is 2 minutes from the objective. I have positive identification of 3 enemy machine gun nests on the northern face of the ridge and a mortar team on the reverse slope. Recon 1 is pinned down in a rock formation at the summit. I am commencing my attack run. West to east, there was no hesitation, no request for permission. It was a statement of intent, a professional informing her chain of command of her actions. Davies finally found his voice, a choked whisper over the intercom. There are man-pads in that valley. We'll be torn to shreds if we go in high. We're not going in high, Sharma replied. She brought the Apache around a rock spire, and the battlefield unfolded before them. The ridgeline was alive with muzzle flashes. Tracers arced through the air towards the small cluster of rocks where the recon team had taken shelter. It was a hornet's nest. Instead of climbing to engage from a safe distance, Sharma did the opposite. She pushed the nose down, dropping the Apache into the valley, below the line of sight of the enemy positions. She flew so low that the rotor wash kicked up clouds of dust from the valley floor. Then, as she approached the ridge, she pulled back on the cyclic, and the Apache seemed to leap upwards, like a predator pouncing on its prey. For a brief, terrifying moment, the gunship was exposed, hanging in the air. Then the world erupted in fire and thunder. The 30mm chain gun on the nose of the Apache roared to life, spitting a stream of high-explosive rounds that tore the first machine gun nest apart in a spray of rock and splintered metal. Almost simultaneously, a pair of rockets streaked from the wing pods, impacting the second nest with devastating accuracy. Sharma jinked the aircraft hard to the left, dodging a stream of incoming tracers, then brought the TADS to bear on the third position. A Hellfire missile leaped from its rail, a silent, deadly projectile that guided itself to the target, obliterating it in a ball of white-hot flame. The entire attack run had taken less than 15 seconds. 3 nests destroyed. The immediate threat to Recon 1 neutralized. She then threw the Apache into a hard bank, circling around to the reverse slope. The mortar team, thinking they were safe, was caught completely by surprise. A second burst from the chain gun silenced them forever. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the steady whump, whump, whump of the Apache's rotor blades as it entered a stable, protective orbit over the recon team's position. Back at FOB Ares, the command tent was silent. A dozen battle-hardened officers and NCOs stood frozen, their eyes glued to the drone feed. They had just witnessed an act of such profound skill and lethal precision that it seemed to defy belief. They had seen hundreds of gun runs in their careers, but they had never seen anything like this. This was not a pilot following a doctrine. This was an artist painting a masterpiece of destruction. The radio crackled again. The voice of the Recon 1 team leader, filled with breathless disbelief and overwhelming relief. Ares Command. Valkyrie 7. I don't know who is flying that bird, but you have angels on your side. All threats neutralized. We are secure. Thank you. Valkyrie, thank you. General Madsen keyed his mic, his voice resonating with an authority that left no room for argument. Valkyrie 7, good work. Return to base. Recon 1, prepare for extraction. As the Apache banked and began its return flight, the general turned away from the screen and looked at his adjutant. Give me Specialist Sharma's complete service record, not the redacted mechanics file. I want a real one. The one that requires my level of clearance to even acknowledge its existence. Get it now. The adjutant, a young, efficient captain, hurried to a secure terminal in the corner of the tent. His fingers flew across the keyboard, entering a series of complex alphanumeric codes. A moment later, a file appeared on the screen, its header stamped with a dozen warnings. Top secret // SCI / for eyes only. The general walked over and stood behind him, reading the screen. The captain's eyes widened, and he let out a low whistle. "My God, sir," he breathed. The general simply nodded, his expression grim. "Just as I thought," he said softly. When the Apache touched down on the landing pad 10 minutes later, its landing was so gentle that it barely seemed to disturb the dust. The engines spooled down, the rotors slowly ceased their spin, and a profound quiet settled over the flight line. The entire ground crew, and every soldier who could spare a moment, had gathered to watch. They stood in a silent, respectful semicircle. The canopy opened. Specialist Sharma unstrapped herself and climbed out, her movements just as deliberate and economical as they had been when she was holding a wrench. She looked exactly the same, a slight figure in a dusty, grease-stained uniform. But everyone saw her differently now. They were not looking at a mechanic. They were looking at a legend. CW3 Davies stumbled out of the back seat, his face pale, his legs unsteady. He looked at Sharma, his eyes filled with a raw, humbling awe. The arrogance was gone, stripped away by the G-forces and the undeniable, terrifying truth of her skill. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What would he possibly say? How could he apologize for an error in judgment so complete, so fundamentally wrong, that it bordered on the absurd? He had not just misjudged a soldier. He had misjudged the very nature of competence itself. His entire worldview had been shattered in the span of 20 minutes. The silence was broken by the sound of boots on gravel. General Madsen was walking towards them, his adjutant at his side. The crowd of soldiers parted for him like the Red Sea. He walked directly to Sharma, his eyes never leaving hers. He stopped a few feet in front of her, his gaze intense. He saw no pride in her eyes, no "I told you so." He saw only a quiet professionalism, the calm of a warrior who had done her job and expected no special recognition for it. The general held a tablet in his hand, the screen displaying the file that had been pulled from the secure server. He didn't need to read it. The contents were already burned into his memory. He turned to face the assembled crowd of soldiers, his voice ringing out across the flight line with the clear, hard finality of a judge delivering a verdict. He began to speak, not to Sharma, but to everyone else, ensuring the lesson of this moment was not lost. "We make assumptions," he began, his voice low but carrying to every ear. "We judge by the rank on a collar, by the dirt on a uniform, by the job title in a file. We build boxes for people, and we expect them to stay in them. Today, we were reminded that our assumptions are meaningless in the face of true competence. Today, we were reminded that the most lethal warriors are often the ones you never see coming." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He then looked directly at a stunned CW3 Davies, his gaze as hard as granite. "Chief, you asked for a pilot. You disrespected a soldier who was ensuring your aircraft was safe to fly. You assumed. You were wrong." He then turned his full attention back to Sharma, and his voice softened, taking on a tone of profound, almost reverent respect. He began to read from the tablet, his words painting a picture that no one present could have ever imagined. "Specialist Anya Sharma," he announced, the name now seeming to carry an impossible weight. "Graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. Top of her class. Recruited directly into the Army's experimental flight program. Chief test pilot for the AH-64E and the now classified Viper attack helicopter prototype. Logged over 3,000 combat flight hours, the majority of which were with Tier 1 Special Operations units in undisclosed locations. Recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Silver Star, and a Bronze Star with V device for valor." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The list of accomplishments was staggering, the stuff of legend. Each medal, each qualification, was a testament to a level of skill and bravery that was almost beyond comprehension. The general continued, his voice steady. 2 years ago, during a covert mission, then Captain Sharma's aircraft was shot down. She evaded capture for 3 days, neutralized an enemy patrol, and carried her wounded co-pilot 20 miles to an extraction point. The co-pilot survived. Captain Sharma, however, sustained injuries that grounded her. She was told she would never fly again. He let that hang in the air for a moment. But she refused a medical discharge. She refused a desk job at the Pentagon. She said that if she couldn't fly the birds, she would fix them for those who could. She voluntarily relinquished her commission, re-enlisted as a specialist, and requested a frontline maintenance assignment. She chose to be here. She chose to serve in any capacity, without fame or recognition. She chose the work over the glory. He looked up from the tablet, his eyes locking with Sharma's. In that moment, he was no longer a general addressing a specialist. He was one warrior acknowledging another. With emotion that was sharp, precise, and filled with a respect that transcended rank, General Madsen raised his hand to his brow and rendered a perfect, formal salute. The silence was absolute. Then, one by one, every officer, every NCO, every soldier on that flight line, including a shamefaced and humbled CW3 Davies, raised their hands and saluted the quiet mechanic. It was a spontaneous, heartfelt tribute, a wave of respect washing over the woman who had asked for none of it. Sharma, for the first time, showed a flicker of emotion, a faint, almost imperceptible nod of her head. It was a simple acknowledgement, an acceptance, the silent professional finally seen. The story of Specialist Sharma and the flight of Valkyrie 7 spread through FOB Aries like wildfire. It was whispered in chow lines, recounted in hushed tones in darkened barracks, and shared over encrypted channels to other bases across the theater of operations. It became more than just a story. It became a parable, a piece of institutional folklore. The details were embellished with each retelling. The 15-second gun run became 10. The number of enemy positions doubled. The near-vertical climb became a physics-defying loop. But the core of the story, the essential truth of it, remained unchanged. The quiet, unassuming mechanic was one of the most decorated and skilled aviators in the entire United States military. She became a living legend, a symbol of the quiet competence that formed the true backbone of the Army. She was the ghost pilot, the wrench of God, or simply the specialist junior enlisted soldiers would walk past her workstation in the hangar with a new sense of reverence, watching as she meticulously calibrated an avionics package or replaced a worn hydraulic line. They saw her not just as a mechanic, but as a guardian, a master who had willingly chosen to walk among them. They learned to see the value in the unglamorous, essential work that kept the war machine running. They saw that true honor was not found in the rank on one's chest, but in the excellence of one's work, regardless of the task. The most profound change, however, occurred in Chief Warrant Officer 3 Davies. The event had not just humbled him. It had fundamentally broken down his arrogance and rebuilt him as a better officer. A few days after the incident, he found Sharma alone in the hangar, long after her shift had ended, performing a diagnostic on a damaged targeting pod. He stood silently for a long moment, watching her work. She didn't acknowledge his presence, her focus entirely on the complex circuitry before her. "Specialist," he finally said, his voice quiet and strained. She didn't look up. "Sir, I came to apologize," he stammered, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "What I said to you, the way I treated you, there's no excuse. I was arrogant. I was ignorant. And I was wrong. Completely and utterly wrong." He took a deep breath. "I've been flying for 15 years. I thought I was one of the best. But what you did up there, I've never seen anything like it. You're not just a pilot. You're an artist. I was a child with a noisemaker, and you were a maestro." Sharma finally paused her work. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable in the dim hangar light. "You get the mission done with what you have, sir," she said simply. "That's the job. The simplicity of her statement struck Davies harder than any rebuke. It was the core of her philosophy. It wasn't about glory or rank or who was better. It was about the mission. It was about the soldiers on the ground. "Can you teach me?" he asked, the question surprising even himself. "That backwards takeoff, the way you use the terrain." "I want to learn." Sharma looked at him for a long moment, then gave a slight nod. "Be on the flight line tomorrow. 0500". She then turned back to her work, the conversation over. For Davies, it was a new beginning. He showed up the next morning, and every morning after that, not as a superior officer, but as a humble student, ready to learn from a master who wore the rank of a specialist. The legend of Anya Sharma solidified into the bedrock of the base's culture. The helicopter she had flown, Valkyrie 7, was unofficially but unanimously renamed the Specialist Ghost. Every pilot who flew it claimed it handled better, that its systems were more responsive, as if imbued with some of its former pilots' impossible skill. A small, brass plaque was quietly affixed to the instrument panel by the ground crew. It didn't bear her name or rank. It just had a single word engraved on it: silence. It was a reminder, a warning against assumptions, a tribute to the quiet professional. The landing pad from which she had taken off was also given a new name. The rough, stenciled sign that had designated it LP-4 was replaced by a professionally painted one that read Sharma's pad. It became a point of pride for the base, a landmark pointed out to every new soldier who arrived. It was the spot where a mechanic had reminded a general of the true meaning of service. The ripple effects of her actions spread beyond the confines of the FOB. General Madsen, a man who understood the power of a good story, made sure of it. He incorporated the incident into the leadership training modules for officers across the command. The story of Specialist Sharma became a required case study at flight schools and command and staff colleges, a stark and powerful illustration of the dangers of hubris and the hidden strength within the ranks. The official doctrine on pilot readiness for forward operating bases was subtly rewritten, incorporating new protocols for identifying and utilizing personnel with critical skills, regardless of their current job assignment. Sharma's quiet act of competence had, in a small but meaningful way, made the entire army stronger and more adaptable. Sharma herself, of course, wanted none of the attention. She deflected praise with a quiet, "Just doing my job, sir," and seemed almost uncomfortable with her newfound fame. She remained a mechanic. She found her satisfaction not in the adulation of her peers, but in the perfect hum of a well-tuned engine, in the clean, logical lines of a schematic, in the knowledge that the aircraft she serviced were the safest and most reliable in the fleet. Her true legacy was not in the single, dramatic flight, but in the countless hours of painstaking, unglamorous work she performed every single day. She mentored the younger mechanics, not with lectures, but by example. She taught them to listen to the machines, to understand their language, to treat every bolt, every wire, every line of code with the utmost respect and precision. She taught them that the foundation of every heroic flight was the quiet, thankless competence of the hands that prepare the aircraft on the ground. She was building a legacy not of personal glory, but of shared excellence. She was forging a new generation of quiet professionals. Weeks turned into months. The harsh sun of the theater bleached the sign on Sharma's pad, and the paint on the Specialist Ghost was scoured by sand and wind, but the legend only grew stronger. It became a foundational myth for the unit, a story told to newcomers to instill in them the core values of the institution: humility, respect, and a relentless pursuit of excellence in all things. A new, cocky young lieutenant, fresh from flight school and full of unearned confidence, once made a dismissive comment about the ground crew, complaining about the speed of a turnaround. An old, grizzled sergeant major, who had been on the flight line that fateful day, didn't yell at the young officer. He simply walked him over to the hangar, to the newly established wall of heroes. Among the framed photos of fallen soldiers and decorated veterans was a simple, unadorned picture of a woman in a greasy jumpsuit, her face smudged, looking intently at the rotor assembly of an Apache. There was no rank, no list of medals beneath it, Just a name, Anya Sharma. Before you complain about the hands that keep you in the air, Lieutenant, the sergeant major said, his voice a low rumble, you learn that story. You learn that competence doesn't wear a flashy uniform. You learn that the person tightening the bolts on your aircraft might be able to fly it better than you ever will. You learn respect. The lieutenant, suitably chastened, spent the rest of his tour treating the ground crew not as his support staff, but as his partners, his equals in the complex machinery of war. The lesson had been passed on. The legacy was alive. Sharma's influence was a quiet one, a subtle shift in the tectonic plates of military culture. She had proven that a warrior's spirit is not defined by their designated role. It is defined by their actions under pressure, by their unwavering commitment to the mission, and by their service to others. She had demonstrated that true strength is not the power to command, but the discipline to serve. Her silence was not an absence of words. It was the presence of a deep, unshakable confidence that needed no external validation. Her competence was her voice, and it spoke a language that everyone, from the lowest private to the highest general, could understand. It was the universal language of action, a language that cuts through the noise of ego and assumption and reveals the simple, unadorned truth of who you really are. Her story became a beacon, a reminder that heroes are not always the ones in the spotlight. Sometimes, they're the ones in the shadows, covered in grease, quietly ensuring the light can continue to shine. They're the foundation upon which everything else is built. The true legacy of a soldier is not etched in stone or memorialized in bronze. It is not found in the pages of a history book or the citation for a medal. True legacy is a living thing. It is the lesson passed from a seasoned veteran to a new recruit. It is the standard of excellence that inspires others to be better. It is the quiet competence that ripples outwards, strengthening the entire chain of command, making everyone around it more effective, more humble, more professional. Anya Sharma's legacy was not the 15-minute flight that saved a recon team. It was the permanent change she inspired in the culture of an entire military base and beyond. It was in the pilot who now treated his crew chief as an equal partner. It was in the young mechanic who now took immense pride in her work, knowing that her hands were the last line of defense for the aircrew. It was in the general who learned to look past the uniform and see the warrior within. Years later, long after Sharma had moved on to another anonymous posting, a new commander visiting FOB Aries asked about the name on the landing pad. An NCO, one who had been a young private on the day of the siege, told him the story. He spoke of the arrogant officer, the impossible flight, and the quiet mechanic who had shocked them all. He spoke of her with a reverence usually reserved for mythological figures. He explained that her story was the first thing every new soldier learned upon arrival. It was their North Star, their reminder that true worth is measured by what you do, not what you say. It was a lesson in humility, a masterclass in professionalism, and a testament to the fact that the most powerful force on any battlefield is a disciplined mind and a steady hand. The story had become more than a memory. It had become a teaching tool, a moral compass. It ensured that the lessons of that day would never be forgotten. It guaranteed that future generations of soldiers would understand that respect is earned through action, that assumptions are the enemy of truth, and that the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.